Our next speaker tonight is MI6. I was delighted and privileged to meet MI6 and David Shaler when I was in London recently. When I was in London, it happens that I met with the 9/11 Truth Group of London and gave a talk about what's happening on the West Coast of the United States in the 9/11 movement. And I can tell you, that, I don't know if there's anyone here from London, but that's an excellent 9/11 group there. And I met them in connection with visiting London and that group. And I found two of the most courageous human beings I've ever met. Annie, along with her partner, David Shaler, who couldn't come here, I think you all know, because he got on a no-fly list. And he spent over, the two of them had spent over 5 years working as intelligence officers for the MI5, which is the equivalent of the FBI in the UK. During their years at the heart of the security state of Britain, they saw an alarming catalog of mistakes, cover-ups, and crimes which led to the deaths of innocent people. In particular, David Shaler had personal experience of a major false flag terrorist operation. His counterparts at the MI6, which is the CIA equivalent there, officially briefed him on a plot to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. This consisted of MI6 officers paying associates of bin Laden over $100,000, there's that number again, in an illegal operation which was not sanctioned by the British government. The attack went wrong and many innocent people died. In the wake of this operation, David and Annie left MI5 and blew the whistle, and that takes a lot of courage to do in the UK. As a result, they've spent 3 years on the run and in hiding in Europe, seeing their own friends, family, and journalists they knew arrested and persecuted. And David Shaler has been to prison not once but twice. Further intelligence has since emerged that proves that the Gaddafi plot went ahead as they described, but the British government continues to refuse to hold an inquiry. They see the Gaddafi plot as one of a sequence of false flag terrorist operations designed to give the UK and the USA the pretext to attack oil-rich Middle Eastern countries. Annie will be addressing us on this and other examples of crimes of the intelligence services. Annie is the author of a book called Spies, Lies, and Whistleblowers, which I've read and I commend it to you. It's from a British publisher, Spies, Lies, and Whistleblowers. You can get it on Amazon. It's an amazing book of what they've revealed about the intelligence services in the UK. And I am honored and privileged to introduce MI6.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Byron, and it's a real privilege to be able to talk to you tonight, to be here in Chicago. Slightly later than I was expecting. I was hoping to be in the bar by now, but never mind, I'm sure I'll make it there later. Also, apologies from David. He was very much looking forward to coming over, but as you heard, he had problems about getting into the country. In fact, so did I. I got grilled 3 times getting through the controls into Chicago. So that was an experience. So I've just given up smoking cigarettes, so I should be really happy about that. And by the time I got through all your stringent border controls, it's the first time in a long time I'd be really tempted to have a fag. Anyway, on to the serious stuff. What I want to do tonight is talk you through some of David's and my experiences and really explain how we moved from working at the dark heart of the secret state to come and talk about 9/11 in Chicago in a public conference. It's been quite an odyssey. Started about 16 years ago. And it's also got a number of ingredients that we find coming up again and again, and particularly even in the 9/11 story itself. You have secret cabals working behind the scenes in intelligence services in order to carry out state-sponsored terrorism. You have lies to the government. You have the control of the media. You have corrupt judges making reckless decisions in courts of law. And, of course, innocent people going to prison. So I hope to give you a flavour of that and give you also a flavour of why David and I are now fully behind campaigning for 9/11 Truth and why we're so involved in the British 9/11 Truth campaign, which is really taking off. So I really want to commend that to you as well. So just to give you a bit of background, I don't know how up or you are on the intelligence infrastructure in the UK. There are three major intelligence agencies. The first one is MI5, which is the agency that Dave and I worked for. That is formerly known as the Security Service, the UKSS, as it's always truncated to. That is a domestic security agency, and it started out looking at espionage and then political subversion. And now it's primarily a counter-terrorist agency, although it still thinks it's primarily an espionage agency, so it works in incredible degrees of secrecy in the way that the police could only dream of. We also have an agency called MI6, which is the James Bond side of things. Well, they like to think so anyway. Although I'd say that on the whole they are more cheap plonk at embassy receptions rather than swanning around Monte Carlo casinos. They also are supposed to work within the law, just like MI5 is, but seem to manage not to most of the time. We also have something called GCHQ, which is the Government Communications Headquarters, I suppose the equivalent of the NSA. And in fact, they have a very cosy little relationship with your NSA. They have an infrastructure called Echelon. I don't know how many of you have heard of that. It's a wonderful relationship because in order to follow the law, GCHQ has to get warrants to intercept any UK telephone numbers. And I understand the NSA is supposed to do the same thing if they want to intercept US telephone numbers. Well, they used to. I know it's changed slightly recently. So in the past, of course, GCHQ would intercept all the US stuff, the NSA would intercept all the UK stuff and share everything. It was wonderful. Wonderful little sidestep around the legalities that are supposed to protect our civil liberties. Anyway, so those are the three organisations, and as I said, David and I were recruited to work in MI5 in the early 1990s, and it was a very long and drawn-out recruitment process, about 8 months in Dave's case and 10 months in mine, and they went to great pains to tell us that MI5 was not the way it had been portrayed in the media. It was not some evil, right-wing, fascistic sort of organisation that investigated innocent left-wing activists. Oh no, they had changed. They were now a fully legal organisation that had to work within the law and had to get warrants in order to do things which would otherwise be illegal, such as bugging our telephones or breaking and entering our homes or whatever. In fact, MI5 was founded, just to give a little bit of history, way back in 1909, and its primary purpose was to investigate the threat of German espionage in the run-up to the First World War. They had moved on slightly in those 80 years, but all that time they didn't exist officially. They worked within the shadows, and anyone who ever wanted to ask anything about them in the Houses of Parliament were told to shut up. You cannot do this. It's national security, old boy. Just keep quiet and don't rock the boat. So they started off looking at German spies. They managed to creep forward and look at Russian spies during the Cold War. And then, of course, they were caught with their trousers down. In the 1950s, there was a huge spy scandal where it emerged that there had been a number of officers working particularly for MI6 who'd been spying for the Soviets. It was called the Cambridge Spy Ring, Burgess, Philby, McLean, and another couple who sort of emerged later. So they were a tad embarrassed, and as a result of this, rather than thinking, well, how are we going to improve how we work, they thought, no, the best way to stop future spies is to investigate all left-wing political activists in the UK, and then we might spot one or two coming through the system who are going to work for the Soviets. Didn't work out quite like that. Left-wing activists are out there, engaged in the democratic process. You know, they are standing in elections, they're holding rallies, they're demonstrating, they're writing things for newspapers. So what? Anyone who was training to be a Soviet spy, on the other hand, tended to, steer clear of any public left-wing activity because it was a bit of a, flag to the security services. Anyway, so that meant that there was a ruling that said that MI5 could investigate a whole plethora of small Trotskyist groups. Now, it wasn't quite as draconian as the whole McCarthy era, but it went on for far longer and it was much more pervasive. There are a whole number of groups in the UK, things like the Communist Party, something called the Socialist Worker Party, Militant Tendency, even anarchist groups, and occasionally looking at some of the right-wing groups. And it was estimated by the time that David and I joined, they had a registry of 1 million files held on UK citizens for their political beliefs. I mean, it's just disgusting. And as I said, these people weren't trying to overthrow the country. They weren't undermining national security. They were just going about, normal political activity. Anyway, roll forward from 1909 to 1989. The Sov bloc comes down, falls apart. MI5 has a bit of a panic, thinking, oh my God, what are we going to do now? We need a new target. And this is a theme that comes up again and again. So they start agitating for new work, and they alight on the fact that the IRA is quite active at that time. However, the politicians do push through some legislation in 1989. First of all, something called the Security Service Act, which actually makes MI5 official for the first time in its 80-year history. They also push through various legislation guaranteeing privacy on your telephones. They have to get warrants, theoretically, to follow the law to intercept your telephone conversations. But to counterbalance all these legal protections to UK citizens, they also put in another piece of law, and that is called the 1989 Official Secrets Act. Now, I understand you don't have an Official Secrets Act yet in this country, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time. But basically, this says that if you work or have worked for the intelligence agencies and you have witnessed crime of any magnitude, it can be, up to and including mass murder, and you are the one, you blow the whistle on that, you are the criminal, not the people who've actually committed that mass murder.
We do have that here.
Do you?
Yeah, it's recent.
Oh, the new whistleblower legislation, the Supreme Court ruling.
Blue Wolf Act. Blue Wolf Act.
Right.
Crimes are out of CIA agent even if they commit murder.
Yeah. Okay, well, you're obviously following in the wake of this wonderful example that the UK is setting. It's a bit like 1776 didn't happen, perhaps. You're learning all our bad habits again. Anyway, this is an appalling piece of legislation, and it has been used time and time again throughout the 1990s, particularly since Blair's come to power, in order to suppress dissent and reporting crime. And David was probably the first whistleblower to come out post New Labour being elected to power, and he's probably been the most persecuted as well. So that's our background. As I said, when we were being recruited in the early 1990s, we were told that MI5 had changed. They were a nice legal organisation, no longer looking at what they called quaintly Reds under the bed, and that they were now looking primarily at terrorism, particularly the IRA. So David and I joined. I don't think either of us would have joined an organisation as it was seen to be in the 1980s, but we did feel it would be a job that would make a difference, that we could actually, it sounds naive now, we could make a difference, we could perhaps stop terrorism, we could save some lives. I would stress, though, that I was very young. I was only about 21, 22 at this stage, and, a bit wet behind the ears, so that's my excuse. Anyway, we were both recruited and joined in 1991. So after all these assurances, and bear in mind as well that when you're being recruited by an agency like MI5, you think, they know everything about me. They must know all the details of my life. So you're probably 100% honest, no sort of gliding over little holes in your CV or anything that you might do for normal job applications. So I've been told. Anyway, David and I both got in. And as they say in all the best pot boilers, imagine our surprise when, after all these reassurances about being counter-terrorism officers, we both find ourselves in a section called F2, which was the counter-subversion section. Counter-subversion, looking at left-wing activists, was in 1991 alive and kicking, even though the Soviet Union had disintegrated in the years before. It gave us a unique insight, though, into the historical aspect of MI5's work, because we saw a whole range of frightening files they'd opened up. One that sticks particularly in my mind was a young boy, I think he was 14 at the time, who had acquired an MI5 file purely for writing into the Communist Party HQ to ask for information and background about communism because he was doing a school project. It sounds ridiculous, but it had serious ramifications for this guy because, of course, you have the file. The file is there for life. It never gets destroyed. And it would have inhibited him taking up certain jobs or getting certain promotions within certain jobs. So, it's not just a sort of little jokey thing. This would stop him doing certain things with his life. We also saw on the other end of the scale, though, a number of files on people who were seen as dangerous subversives in the 1970s and 1980s, usually when they were student politicians. These include those well-known radicals, Tony Blair, Jack Straw, until recently the Foreign Secretary, Peter Mandelson, one of our EU commissioners now, John Prescott, the disgraced Deputy Prime Minister, Robin Cook, the late Foreign Secretary, a whole range of people who are now in the government or have been in the government. And we saw these files because, as I said, we were working for F2. We were there during 1992 when there was a general election. And what happens is anyone who stands as an MP in the UK has their name cross-referenced with MI5's database. If they have a file, the file is called up, the file is assessed to see if they are a threat to the integrity of the nation, particularly if they get elected and particularly if they are going to go into the cabinet or the shadow cabinet. This information is assessed, a threat assessment is made, and passed to the new Prime Minister or the new head of the opposition. So Dave and I had an amazing insight into the activities of these people. And I think perhaps that's one reason why they have been so unforgiving about David blowing the whistle. We know particularly that Tony Blair was very paranoid about what Shayla knew when he went public. Intriguing, but I shall say no more tonight. Anyway, there is a serious point to that, because these are the very politicians who are supposed to hold our spies to account. MI5 is supposed to be under the power of the Home Secretary, MI6 under the power of the Foreign Secretary, with the Prime Minister as the overall boss. Now, these guys have files held on them by the spies. They have big fat files full of personal information. Who is in charge of who? Whom, even, if I'm going to be grammatical. It's a case of the tail wagging the dog. This is not real democracy. This is undermining the real nature of democracy if our elected representatives cannot hold these guys to account. So that was our initiation into the work of MI5 and the historic work of MI5. We then moved on to what we thought we were going to be doing after a couple of years. That was looking at the Irish terrorist question, and then we spent a couple of years looking at international terrorism, Middle Eastern primarily. And I just want to go through a few things that we saw going wrong, because it really gives you a flavour of why we went public, why we felt we had to take the risk to go public. So yes, in the Irish section, we saw a whole range of investigations which weren't carried out properly. This was at the height, when we moved into looking at the Irish question, at the height of the IRA's mainland campaign in the UK. As I said, MI5 got a little bit worried when the Soviet Union fell apart. They started looking around for a new area of work. So they lobbied Whitehall, they lobbied the government to take over the lead responsibility of looking at IRA activity in the UK. Up until that point, for the previous 120 years, the Metropolitan Police had been responsible for that. Anyway, MI5 took it on, and in that period, more bombs were put down on British streets than ever before or ever after. They were just appalling at their job. And this wasn't because there was a lack of will to do something about it. The intelligence officers, the desk officers who were running the operations, were working themselves into the ground trying to stop attacks. The problem was the management, because they'd all grown up and cut their teeth in the era of looking at political activists and espionage, which is a nice, slow-moving, gentlemanly sort of game. You want to put a bug in on the telephone line of the Soviet embassy, you can spend a few weeks drafting the perfect warrant and you don't have to worry about them moving on and doing something nasty. You want to put a bug on a fast-moving terrorist target, you need to get that warrant out immediately. It doesn't matter if the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed accurately. You want to make sure that the case is accurate and you get the intelligence in. They just could not recognise that, and they kept hampering all the operations that were going ahead. So a couple of notorious instances when they could and should have stopped bombs going off on British streets. And one of them was Bishopsgate. which happened in April 1993, and a huge lorry bomb was planted in the middle of the city of London. And it was probably, I think it still is, the most expensive, in financial terms, the most expensive attack that's ever happened on UK soil, because it blew the heart out of the city. It brought the city to a standstill for weeks. It cost £350 million in insurance payouts alone, and a couple of innocent lives were lost. So it was a huge attack. It was a huge publicity coup for the IRA. And the guy who planted that bomb, who drove the lorry bomb right into the heart of the city and set it off, should have been arrested 6 months before that. He'd been over in the UK with a different lorry bomb. He'd been tracked by A4, which is the surveillance section in MI5, and he had been seen to leave this lorry bomb, park it up, and disappear off one night. So MI5 went in with terribly high-tech equipment, went on top of the lorry and drilled a hole, literally with a hand drill, and had a look in. And they saw, yes, the lorry was full of fertilizer, homemade explosive, about a ton of it. It would have been a huge bomb. And decided to withdraw discreetly and wait for the driver to come back so they could arrest him in flagrante, so to speak. And lo and behold, Cyril McGuinness did turn up. He came to pick up his lorry, but something spooked him. I think he realised perhaps he was being watched or whatever. Anyway, he was there. He was with the lorry. He looked in the back. He knew what it was. There was no doubt about it. He wasn't just picking it up for a friend or something. And they wanted to go in and arrest him. So they rang up the head of the counter-terrorist squad in the Metropolitan Police. At that point, the Met was still in the lead. And he just couldn't be found. Nobody could trace him. They tried all the different numbers they had for him. He just was not available. And then because of that, anyone else lower down the pecking order was too frightened to take the executive decision to arrest this terrorist. And it just shows you, this is the old classic old British hierarchical thinking. So Cyril McGuinness walked away, and in fact there's a famous photograph of him looking up at one of the surveillance cameras and going like that. So he knew what was going on, and he was being very cheeky about it. Anyway, so he scooted back off to the Republic of Ireland. 6 months down the line, comes back to the UK, sets off the Bishopsgate bomb. I mean, it's just crazy. And nobody was ever held to account over that as well. That's another classic British attack. There are another 2 bombs that went off as well. It was up in the northeast of England, near Newcastle, where 2 bombs were put on gas pipelines. And there were 2 pipelines chosen out of a choice of 7. And by pure fluke, the bomber put the 2 bombs on the only 2 empty pipelines. If you put them on any of the other 5, the whole lot would have blown up, and he would have taken out a row of terraced houses. I mean, it was that close. Anyway, it was a guy called Sean McNulty. He's subsequently been convicted. He was sentenced to 22 years, and obviously let out a few years ago under the Good Friday Agreement. He should, again, have been arrested, or at least way before the attacks happened, or at least as he was going to plant the bombs, caught red-handed. What happened was he was working in Newcastle, and then one day he just disappeared. He borrowed his mother's car to disappear off for the day. He obviously thought his car was bugged, which it was. So he borrowed his mother's car, and the surveillance just lost track of him. And it turned out that he'd gone up to see the coordinator of the IRA mainland campaign up in Scotland. This is a man called Hugh Jack, and Phelim Hamill, there were 2 of them, holed up in a small farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in central Scotland. Now, it was known that that was the headquarters of the IRA campaign. It was under surveillance. It was being watched. And Sean McNulty turned up there. Now, there was a CCTV camera out there which took pictures of the guy arriving, and it would have placed him right at the heart of the IRA mainland campaign at that point. So, of course, he would have been followed, been picked up as he was planting the bombs. Apart from the fact, the photographs taken of him going into this house were not seen. They didn't reach MI5 HQ for 12 days. Now, this was in 1993. This is in an era when you could pass photographs electronically down the wires to newspapers within, a nanosecond. But MI5, really up on technology as always, still had its old working practices, and that included getting a little van to drive up from London all the way to Scotland, go all the way around all the different police forces picking up their sensitive material, and driving it all the way back down to London again. This happened once a fortnight. High-tech stuff, indeed. So, it took 12 days for these photographs to arrive in MI5 and for the desk officer to look at them and realise McNulty was involved. During that time, the day before those photographs arrived, he'd planted his bombs. Then, and this desk officer, by strange coincidence, happens to be David, he was appalled by what had happened. So he decided to write a brief that would go out around Whitehall, highlighting this mistake in the hope that Whitehall would insist MI5 changed its working practices. I mean, everyone can make mistakes, but you've got to learn and change. You can't just sit back on your hands and, hope everything's going to be okay. So he wrote his brief, his report of the operation. First addressee was HMQ, Her Majesty the Queen. Second was PM, Prime Minister. So it was really going out to people who would hopefully make a difference. So again, imagine his surprise when he got the formal published version back, and there was no mention of this 12-day delay. The report just made it sound as if the photos were taken the day after the bombs were put down. So his management had changed what he was saying. They had lied to government. They'd lied to their democratic political masters. When he raised this with his management, he was just told to shut up. Shh, don't say a word. Very much a case of just do as you're told, follow orders, don't rock the boat. That was classic MI5 mentality. There was a sort of coda to this because the senior manager at the time who told him to do this, ended up as one of his witnesses for the prosecution during his trial. And of course, David wasn't allowed to cross-examine him properly. Anyway, that was the IRA years. I'll move on to the last section that we both worked in, which was called G Branch. And that was looking at international Middle Eastern terrorism. David, when he was working there, was the head of the Libyan section, which meant he was looking not only at Libyan activity within the UK mainland, but also activity abroad and trying to coordinate a response to stuff that appeared in the media about, about Lockerbie, things like that. During that time, I think that's when we saw the most serious things going wrong in MI5. First of all, they decided to bug a left-wing journalist who was fairly well known. She was a deputy foreign editor of a national newspaper called The Guardian. And the senior management got terribly excited about this because it was lefty, just like the good old days, don't want to worry about terrorists, they're all a bit difficult, but left-wing journalists, we know what to do. So they went ahead and bugged this woman, but they didn't get a warrant. They didn't get a properly written warrant, so the whole operation was illegal. And again, David started complaining about this and saying, look, we can't do this, we're breaking the law. And also spending a huge amount of money, because this bug was kept in place for a year. It cost MI5 over £750,000 just to process the information coming off that one bug. And of course, other things were going on which were of minor interest, like, letting a known Libyan intelligence officer come terrorist into the UK and having to follow him around. But no, let's look at the left-wing journalist. The other thing as well that we saw, this wasn't strictly speaking in either of our sections. It was in a section called G9B, which was looking at the Iranian target. But this was a case of two innocent Palestinians who were put in prison, are still in prison. I mentioned this morning at the state terrorism talk. Basically, there was an attack against the Israeli embassy in London in July 1994. And the Israelis had been hassling for increased protection around their embassy in London for the preceding few months because there had been a couple of other big attacks against their interests around the world. Now, MI5 had no intelligence to suggest that any Arab terrorist groups were planning an attack against the Israeli embassy. London had traditionally been a sort of safe haven for Middle Eastern groups because they were given a certain amount of freedom of expression and things. So they didn't think they had either the capability or the intent to carry out an attack in London. So the Israelis were getting quite frustrated about this. They were also, because of this safe haven idea, getting increasingly frustrated at a political network which had been set up by a bunch of immigrant Palestinians. And it was doing very well. I mean, they were really raising awareness about their people's plight. They were raising money and funds and sending them back to the Middle East to help them. So a bomb goes off. Two innocent Palestinians were picked up. They were part of this support network. And they were subsequently convicted, not of the attack, because they had cast iron alibis, but they were convicted of conspiracy to cause this attack. And it looks like they were set up, they were fitted up, because there was a shadowy figure called Rida Maghrabi who kept swimming in and out of their story. He was never traced, even though he was the one that bought the car that the bomb was in. He's the one who was, all asking them to put themselves in certain places at certain times, which led to the circumstantial case against them, which led to their convictions. But nobody bothered to try and trace him. And I think he was probably an Israeli agent. But the crucial thing that David saw was a report written by a senior MI5 officer. His code name was G91. And he had seen all the evidence and all the intelligence, more crucially, in the run-up to this attack. And his assessment, his view, was that Mossad had bombed their own embassy. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but that's what this guy said. Now, it sounds a bit crazy, but as I said, they wanted increased security. They also wanted to shatter this Palestinian support network, and they did, because these two people who were then convicted, of course, everyone else who worked with them just ran for cover. They went underground, and in fact, the network hasn't been really rejuvenated ever since. I should say as well, one was a young woman called Samar Alami, one a young man called Jawed Botme, both professionals, engineers working in London. And they were both sentenced to 20 years each for conspiring to commit a terrorist atrocity. Now, David went public about this. He said, look, MI5 have a serious considered view that these guys were not responsible in any way for this attack. Now, you think a whistleblower comes forward and actually says this. So immediately, any sense of justice, these two people would have their convictions quashed. And perhaps, if there's evidence implying that they knew evidence, that there'd be a retrial at the very least, but they should be released and the case looked at again. Not in the UK. That would have been vindication for David Shayler, and the government couldn't afford that. So in order to make sure that a whistleblower didn't get any credit in the national media, they played fast and loose with these two people's lives. They have never been released. They haven't had a retrial. They are still rotting in prison. They've been in their cells now for over 10 years. They've got another 9 years to go, just because the government won't give Shayler any satisfaction. I mean, I just think that is absolutely psychopathic. The final thing I want to talk about from the MI5 years is something that's become known as the Gaddafi plot in the media. And this is really why we started looking at the 9/11 issue as well, because I think this is an early example of state-sponsored false flag terrorism with a view to invading an oil-rich Middle Eastern country. As I said, David was the head of the Libyan section in MI5, and he, rather unusually, built up a very good working relationship with his counterparts in MI6. Now, I say it's very unusual because the two agencies loathed each other. Absolutely. They were competing for the same resources, they were competing for profile in front of their political masters, and they had very different cultures. MI6 was very patrician, grand public schools like Eton, Oxbridge colleges, that sort of thing. MI5 was more sort of minor public school, grammar school, Oxbridge, Red Brick, whatever. So there was a sort of classist issue there as well. It's terribly British. And in this case, MI6, as I said, David had a very good relationship with his counterparts in MI6. So they did tell him what they were up to. They officially briefed him on an operation that they were running in Libya. So the detail of this is that in 1995, a Libyan military intelligence officer walked into the British embassy in Tunis and said, I'd like to speak to the local MI6 person, please. This is why they always live in embassies, because, spies know where to find them. Anyway, lo and behold, the local MI6 officer popped up, and they had a nice little chat. The Libyan military intelligence officer subsequently became codenamed Tunworth, so I'll refer to him as that now. He said to the MI6 officer that he had a cunning plan. He had a group of ragtag Islamic terrorists, this is his phrase, that had a plot. They were planning a coup against Colonel Gaddafi. But what they needed, crucially, was funding. They needed money in order to buy the equipment, the explosives, the guns, even the jeeps and the tents, to build their camp. But they had a group of people who were intent on deposing and assassinating Gaddafi. And then they would take power, and they would, as a quid pro quo for the help that MI6 would give them, hand over the two Lockerbie suspects, who were at that time wanted for trial in the UK. Now, this was one of the primary objectives of MI6. It was to get the two over for trial. And they've made zero progress over the years. So they really jumped at this. And they started throwing money at this guy. They didn't wait to build a relationship with him. They didn't wait to find out what's really making him tick. And he also confessed to being an associate of bin Laden. So, actually perhaps that reassured them because, of course, bin Laden's a known CIA asset, I don't know. Anyway, they started throwing money at this guy, and there were at least two, probably 3 or 4 payments of about $40,000 to Tunworth over a period of a few months. He duly went off and bought all his equipment, set up his terrorist camp in Libya, and Dave wasn't really aware of all this going on. When he was initially briefed about this, he thought it was just yet another MI6 fantasy. I mean, they were always coming up with mad plots and boys' own adventurism and all that sort of thing. And very rarely did they actually go out and do anything. But unfortunately, in this case, they did. And it was in about February 1996, David was sitting behind his desk, and intelligence started coming in from a variety of sources, which said that an attack had happened near a town called Sirte in Libya, where Colonel Gaddafi was travelling in a cavalcade of cars. He'd gone out, he was on a meet and greet with his people, everyone was standing there waving their Libyan flags, and a bomb or grenade had exploded under one of the cars. Now, obviously, they didn't get the man. Colonel Gaddafi is still very much alive and the new best buddy of Bush and Blair. The bomb went off under the wrong car, so innocent people were immediately killed in that. There was also a security guard shootout. Obviously, they went in to try and protect their leader. Innocent bystanders were gunned down. It was a massacre. It was horrible. And as I said, obviously, Gaddafi survived. But when the MI6 officer came over to tell Dave about this, and Dave said, well, look, I've seen these reports from the other sources. Was this what you were talking about? And he said, yes, that was our man. We did it. And Dave just said, no, you didn't. Gaddafi's still there. What are you talking about? But they were really pleased they'd actually managed to get something organised, even if they didn't get the result they wanted. Anyway, the other worrying thing, obviously, loss of life, which, of course, MI6 just called collateral damage in their usual psychopathic way. This appalling loss of life had gone on. But then it turned out that they hadn't followed the law in trying to get this operation off the ground. Now, I said at the start that MI5 was put on a legal footing in 1989 with the Security Service Act. GCHQ and MI6 weren't put on a legal footing until 1994 with a piece of law which was called the Intelligence Services Act. And this basically said that MI6 officers had immunity under law for any crime they committed abroad if they got the permission of their political master, the Foreign Secretary, in writing before they committed that act. So, people look at James Bond and think, oh, it's all fantasy, they can't really have exploding pens, etc., etc. Well, most of it is. But one thing that is true is that they can have a license to kill. It's crazy, but that's the case under the Intelligence Services Act, if they get the Foreign Secretary to say so. That would only mean that they cannot be prosecuted in the UK for acts committed abroad. It shouldn't give them a carte blanche. But in this case, the Gaddafi plot, they hadn't bothered to get that say-so from the Foreign Secretary. And I'm hardly surprised, because, how do you say, yeah, we're going to go and assassinate a foreign head of state? Can we have your signature, sir? It wouldn't really work like that. So the act was not only immoral, unethical, incredibly reckless in that part of the world as well, but it was illegal. And you would think that the officers who plotted this would at least have been arrested, questioned, possibly charged with conspiracy to murder. No, Dave was the one who was put in prison for this. But as I said, I think that is probably another example of an attempt to grab the assets of a Middle Eastern country which is oil-rich. Of course, if the coup had happened as the way that Tunworth suggested, you would have had Tunworth and like-minded fellow travellers as the new government in Libya. So you would have an al-Qaeda state in North Africa, who would either be grateful to MI6 and play ball and allow British petroleum back into the country, or would be awkward and say, no, this is our country, disappear. And then, of course, there would have been a perfect excuse to go and invade Libya. Imagine going to the UN, the UK, US, saying, look, they've got an al-Qaeda state, acknowledged friends of bin Laden. We can't have this in North Africa. It's strategically impossible. So it would have been the perfect pretext for an invasion. So as I said, that was the reason we left MI5. That was the reason we went public. And that's also the reason we got interested in the 9/11 truth movement. I don't see 9/11 as any way an isolated incident. Anyway, just to give you a flavour of once we turned poacher rather than gamekeeper. We left in 1996. We got other jobs as management consultants, so sort of vaguely respectable, I suppose, certainly better than being a spy. And then we'd already taken steps to go public, because within MI5 we had tried and raised issues time and time again. concerns about lying to government, concerns about not doing operations properly, and obviously concerns about the Gaddafi plot. Dave had raised this with his bosses and really made a fuss and got nowhere. He was just repeatedly told, shut up, keep quiet, just follow orders. It's terribly Nazi, the whole thing. Anyway, so we left and we took steps to go public, as I said. Now, under the Official Secrets Act, which is the law that prevents whistleblowing, the first section is called Section 1.1. It says, if you are a former or serving intelligence officer and you speak to anyone ever about the work you did in MI5, you are guilty of a breach of the Official Secrets Act. Primary legislation, clear-cut, no defence under law whatsoever. You face 2 years in prison and/or an unlimited fine. So David knew what he was up against. But we also knew there was no other way of doing it. Even by going to the Prime Minister, as we understood it, as we've been told in MI5, would have been a breach of the Official Secrets Act. You couldn't go to your representative, you couldn't go to your MP, you couldn't even go to the police. This is what we've been told time and time again. This is what we signed in MI5. So, what to do? We thought at least if we went public about it, one, it would force a public inquiry, and two, of course, you have a certain degree of protection from the journalists, well, theoretically anyway. As I said, this is a long time ago. I was very young and naive. Anyway, as I said, we left. We had already made contact with the newspaper that would break the story before we left, and David took copies of a number of documents, nothing dangerous, nothing containing agent names or anything like that, just to prove his bona fides, kept them safe. So fast forward, a period of 10 months. It took a long time to get this whole thing going. I think because it took, there was a lot of mutual suspicion between the journalist and Dave. Obviously, the journalist thought he might be being set up by MI5 in some evil way, and Dave wanted to make sure he could trust the journalist and wasn't going to be shocked. But eventually, in July 1997, the story broke. We were told that, yes, it was finally going to go. We had 3 days warning after about 10 months of cranking up the tension and thinking we were being watched by MI5 and things. So we knew that we had to get out of the country. We wanted to go on the run, get out, otherwise they would come knocking, we'd be hauled off by the secret police, the special branch, and put in prison for a period of up to 2 years, waiting on remand for a trial under the Official Secrets Act. So, perhaps looking back, we should have just stood there and taken the shock, I don't know. But it was frightening, and we did leave. We fled to Europe and literally went on the run for a month. I mean, it was a case of moving from hotel to hotel, changing every night, every other night. But I suppose at least we learnt something useful in MI5. We managed to stay one step ahead of them for a good time. So gamekeeper turned poacher definitely works. Anyway, the story broke, as I said, in 1997. It was huge at that stage. It dominated the news in the UK. Also, as well, within the week that followed the story breaking, the government took out an injunction against both David and against the national media in the UK, effectively saying that they couldn't report anything more that he had to say about MI5. They banned it. Now, it was all entirely predictable. Of course the government was going to do something draconian like that. And of course, the national media in the UK was up in arms. What about press freedom? You can't gag us. This is all in the public interest. So it all looked like actually we were going to get a lot of media protection. It looked really good for a brief period of about 5 hours. Unfortunately then, Princess Diana died that night. And you can't really compete with that as far as news headlines goes. I could say a few words about the Diana thing. I've been asked about it a few times today. Is there people interested? A little detour? Okay. It was interesting timing. The reason I want to raise this particularly with personal experience of the case, I mean, I know there's all sorts of speculation about what really happened and was Henri Paul drunk and, why they took the route they did. It was completely circuitous. But David and I had personal involvement in it. Apart from the timing, which really screwed our lives over for about a year afterwards. About 2 months after her death, we had a mysterious phone call. And it turned out it was Mohammed Al-Fayed, who wanted us to go to Paris and look at some documents he'd been offered. So, at this point, we're living in a very remote farmhouse. Black Ritz Mercedes comes to pick us up and take us to Paris. And almost crashes twice. So that could have been a good headline. Anyway, we look at the documents. He's been offered these for sale from a guy who's very vague about how he got hold of them.
Oswald the Winter.
That's the one. These were documents purporting to prove that there was CIA and MI6 involvement in Diana's death. And they looked good. But if you knew what a document really looked like, what a proper MI6 document looked like, there were some simple errors, things like the date timeline, things like the addressee list, they just weren't quite right. They were forgeries, they were very good forgeries. And this would have been a classic straw man technique. You know, Al-Fayed was asked for $20 million for these documents and probably would have paid if they were real, because he was desperate to prove that there was a plot against his son and his possible future daughter-in-law. Anyway, we saw that they were forgeries, they were fakes, and it saved him $20 million, but also saved him embarrassment. This would have been a classic straw man operation, whereby he would have bought them, held them up to the world's media and said, look, I've got proof. And then the authorities would have turned around and said, look, it's so obvious, look at these simple errors, of course they're forgeries. You can imagine what would have happened. Anything else he ever found out, he would have been dismissed as a fantasist. So, you know, his entire campaign for justice for his son would have stalled pretty much before it started. Anyway, as the lady down there said, the guy who was trying to flog him these documents was a well-known con man called Oswald or Oscar Lewinter. He was also notoriously an MI6 agent. He was quite well known. Most agents were pretty, their identities were quite tightly held. He was pretty well known, though, because he seemed to get involved in all sorts of dodgy activities. So that, to us, proved that there was an MI6 interest in this. And then, of course, we started looking at the other evidence and all the rest of it. And I have to say, my personal opinion, I think, yes, they did intend to at least seriously injure or kill her. And it's not just about the fact that, was she pregnant, wasn't she? We'll never know, because they embalmed her against all French law so quickly. And all the other speculative things you see in the press. It's also the fact that it was reported that she was being a great success in the landmine campaign that she was running.
Yes.
But also, she was about to go into campaigning on the behalf of the Palestinians. Now, you can imagine someone of Princess Diana's profile doing that. They would not have tolerated it. They could not have dealt with that. So I think that's why she was taken out. I think they'd probably been planning it for a while, and it was just perfect timing. They did it when they did. Anyway, that's my little detour down the Diana path. In terms of what happened to us then, as I said, we'd gone on the run. We'd flown to Holland. We spent a week just moving around. It was like something out of a very bad spy film, actually. Since going public, it's been much more spy-like than it was working for them. And finally, after a month of doing that, I decided that I had to go back to the UK. I'd fly back, I knew I'd get arrested, but I wanted to prove that I had nothing to hide. I mean, apart from the fact I was Shayla's girlfriend. I wanted to prove that I was free to travel backwards and forwards. So I went back, and I flew back with my lawyer, who was the head of the equivalent of the ACLU, a guy called John Wadham. And I also knew that I was going to be interviewed, but what I wasn't expecting was to be picked up by the heavies at the immigration desk of Gatwick, taken off to a terrorism suite in Charing Cross Police Station and grilled for 6 hours. During that time, David managed to find somewhere to hole up in France. A friend of a friend had offered us this farmhouse to hide in. So I went back to the UK, got arrested, grilled, all the rest of it. And then also I had to try and pack up our flat. I mean, we'd only had 3 days warning before we finally went on the run. And also deal with our families, because again, they'd had no warning that we were going to do what we did. By the time it all happened, we were so security conscious that we wouldn't talk about it over the phone. We wouldn't talk about it in the flat that we were living in. We'd always go outside to have a conversation, or go outside for a cigarette officially. The families, of course, were incredibly shocked, because the first they heard about it, unfortunately, was picking up the national newspapers on Sunday and seeing the headlines. So that was quite a fraught week from my point of view. As I said, David went and holed up in his little remote farmhouse. When I say remote, it was so remote. It was about 2 miles away from the nearest village. We had no car because we'd have had to register it. We had to keep hidden. So we had to walk down to the village to get our bread and our cassoulet and basic food and cigarettes, of course. It's a recurring theme at this point in my life. In fact, it was so old-fashioned, the place we were living in, the heating kept breaking down. We ended up at one point living in temperatures of -8 degrees Celsius with no heating, no hot water. The only thing we had was an open wood fire, which we had to cook over. So who said spying was glamorous? Anyway, during that time, as I said, they'd taken out an injunction against David, which they stayed against him, but they dropped against the national media, strangely enough. And he spent his time trying to negotiate with the government. He kept saying, look, I've got all this information. I want you to take this information. I want you to investigate it. I want you to hold these people to account. They're not doing their jobs properly. They're not protecting British citizens properly. And they're cutting corners and breaking the law. I mean, what more do you need to do your job and hold these people to account? Anyway, the government just kept ignoring him. They just said, we're not interested. You're a criminal. You broke the law. Go away. So after 10 months of this, he decided to use the terms of the injunction to bring out the details of the Gaddafi plot. He hadn't gone public with this straight away because he just thought it was too serious. He wanted to make sure he could get an inquiry into it. After 10 months, he decided, right, I'm going to try and get this out. I'm going to submit it under the terms of the injunction for clearance by MI5 and then get it published. We went up to Paris that weekend. It was the end of July 1998 by now. And we were talking to the journalist and saying, look, we want to break this story. And then David submitted this information on a Friday afternoon. Now, I don't know what the bureaucrats are like in this country, but most bureaucrats in the UK sort of switch off by about 12 p.m. on Fridays and go down the pub. So it was quite unusual for them to suddenly swing into action and issue an urgent extradition request against David, which they then fired off to the French. Now, the French had to act on this. They had to arrest him. But as I said, thank God we were actually up in Paris that day. So David spoiled himself. He treated himself. He went out to an English pub in Paris, there are a few of them, to watch his football team playing on Sky Television. They lost, of course. Middlesbrough usually lose, or they did in those days, 1-0. And he was on his way back to the hotel where I was waiting to meet him, and we were going to go out for a bit of food. He was picked up by the French secret police as he came into the hotel foyer. He thought initially, because they didn't have proper ID or anything, he thought initially they were terrorists, perhaps coming to kidnap him or something. They were going to take him away without telling me what had happened. They said they weren't arresting him, just taking him for questioning, but they were going to spirit him off. However, they asked him for proof of his identity. In France, you have to carry your ID cards, your papers all the time. And he was, he's not a slow-witted chap sometimes, he can think on his feet. So he told them that his passport was up in the hotel room, knowing full well that it wasn't, but that I was. So there I was, just got dressed up to go out for a bit of food. There's a knock on the door. I think, fantastic, Dave's back. Oh no, the football, they lost. Oh God, he's going to be in a mood. Then I opened the door, and it was the knock on the door that we've been waiting for 10 months. And, you just stand there and you can feel your knees going. You think, oh my God, what's going to happen now? And it was 3 secret policemen. They wanted Dave's passport and all the rest of it. But at least I knew what had happened to him, as I said. And I asked if I could say goodbye to him. They said, no, he's gone already. There's no point, we've taken him away. And that was the last I saw of him for 2.5 months. Bear in mind, up until this point as well, we've been living within each other's pockets down in our little French farmhouse, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Suddenly he disappeared, and that was it. I wasn't allowed to visit him in prison. The British lied about him to the French. They said he was a spy, a traitor, selling secrets to an enemy power. So the French put him under very stringent secrecy laws, kept him isolated. Eventually, after about 3 days, he was allowed to see a lawyer, which was generous of them. But as I said, he wasn't allowed to see friends, family, me, for most of his time in prison. The British, of course, took their time sending over the paperwork, the full 40 days. And eventually, the French court made a decision. This was in November 1998. They actually shocked the British, because the British going around saying, of course he'd be extradited, manifestly a criminal, no problem. And the French, bless them, said, and perhaps I shouldn't say that in America, but the French did a good job here. Absolutely. In this case, they said that if David was a whistleblower, it was manifestly a political action he'd taken to report the crimes of the intelligence agencies. It's part of political dissent. And they did not extradite people for political activity. So they told the Brits to shove off. So that was a hell of a party that night, I can tell you. But it was one of those life-changing moments. It was pivotal. You go into a courtroom, your partner is either going to be free that night with you, or he's going to go back to England, held in a high-security prison for up to 2 years, put on trial, everything. So in terms of intensity of experience, I don't think you can get much sharper than that. Anyway, he was released, hell of a party, as I said, and then we relocated to Paris. There was no point going back to our little French farmhouse at that point. We got a very cool little flat on Boulevard Voltaire, and spent the next 2 years campaigning from Paris. So I was free to travel backwards and forwards. Although I'd been arrested under the Official Secrets Act, I was never charged. I was never convicted, obviously. So I'd proven that I was free to travel. I spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards to London, talking to journalists, talking to lawyers, campaigning on Dave's behalf, while he beavered away writing his books and writing articles and using the internet in Paris. After about 2 years, we'd really taken it as far as we could. We'd seen all sorts of things going on, though, in that time. First of all, I don't know if there was any reporting of this over here, but there was a case of someone called Melita Norwood, who became known as the Granny Spy. And she was a self-confessed traitor. She said on camera, yeah, I sold secrets to the KGB for a number of years. Yeah, nuclear secrets, what's the big deal? This came out in about 1999, and she was pretty, small little old lady by then. And it turned out that MI5 had known about this, but mucked up the case and not prosecuted her, so they'd allowed a traitor to get away scot-free. Compare and contrast, there's another case of a young woman called Julianne Davis, who was a student at a university in London. And she had ambitions to be a journalist. So she came over to Paris, did a little interview with David, and took her tape back to her university. She was going to write it up for a university magazine. So again, imagine her surprise when she was sitting in her lecture theatre one day, doing her notes, being a very good student, and a special branch, secret police officers, burst into the lecture theatre and hauled her out. They arrested her not under the 1989 Official Secrets Act, but under the even more draconian 1911 Official Secrets Act, which was there for treachery. I mean, it beggars belief, it really does. This is a young woman, a student, who had interviewed David for her student newspaper. And they did this to her, which of course she's still suing for wrongful arrest. So compare and contrast. Granny spy traitor, student activist. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Anyway, as I said, after about 2 years, we'd really taken it as far as we could. David decided to go back to the UK voluntarily in the summer of 2000. He knew he'd be arrested as soon as he set foot in the UK. He knew he'd be put on trial. However, he thought, well, whatever he'd done was years ago. The police must have finished their investigations by now, even the police. And the trial would happen within about 6 months. He was going to plead not guilty on the basis that there was the Official Secrets Act was too draconian. It was not proportionate to completely ban reporting of crimes, freedom of expression. You had to have some outlet in order to report crimes without breaking the law. So he came back to the UK. He was arrested as soon as he set foot in Dover. However, he didn't go on trial for over 2 years. Now, the reason for the delay was they hauled him through a whole series of pre-trial hearings in order to ensure that he wasn't allowed to say anything in his defence by the time he came in front of a jury. So they wanted to make sure that there'd been a series of legal rulings saying that, yes, the Official Secrets Act, of course, was proportionate. Of course, sending someone to prison for reporting the crimes of the spies was proportionate. Of course, that was okay. And the British judicial system being what it is, that's what they got. One of David's law lords who heard his case was Brian Hutton, of Lord Hutton fame. Another guy who made his name, got his peerage by being the chief prosecutor in Northern Ireland, that place of renowned fair trials. He then went on to hear David's case and ruled that the Official Secrets Act was proportionate, that nobody could say anything ever about their intelligence work. And then, of course, went on to look at the death of Dr. David Kelly, the whistleblower, the Hutton whitewash it became known as. Of course, his ruling was directly influential on what happened to Kelly. Because if he'd said, no, there has to be some vent for people reporting crimes, they shouldn't be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act if they wanted to legitimately blow the whistle, David Kelly wouldn't have ended up dead in the woods. He could have gone and reported what he knew about the false claims about weapons of mass destruction before the Iraq War. He could have stopped the Iraq War. He could have stopped what's gone on there and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. But he couldn't do it because of the Official Secrets Act. It's just, as I said, beggars belief. Anyway, so David's trial takes over 2 years to even get in front of a jury. By the time he gets there, there is no defence under law. So we have this wonderful system where you have two types of lawyers, solicitors that you talk to, who then talk to the barristers who represent you in court, a series of Chinese whispers. With no defence under law, no barrister could represent him, so he had to defend himself as well. And then we had this wonderful judge called Alan Moses, who just chucked out most legal precedent in Dave's case, just rewrote the legal books. He ensured that when David came to cross-examine the prosecution witnesses including his former boss who lied to the government, he wasn't allowed to question them freely. You know, adversarial legal cases, you're supposed to be able to test the witnesses, see if they're lying, test their credibility, their character. He wasn't allowed to do it. He had to submit any questions he wanted to ask to the judge and the prosecuting counsel for vetting before he could ask them. So, of course, they crossed them all out. Well, you would, wouldn't you? He wasn't allowed to get the jury to ask questions to determine the facts. The judge told him to shut up. He wasn't allowed to say why he'd done what he'd done. He wasn't allowed to mention the Gaddafi plot during his trial. And when it came to the jury making their decision, the judge ordered them to convict. Now, I noticed there was a young chap handing out leaflets about jury nullification earlier. Absolutely, it's a good move. But we had that in the UK as well. There's a legal precedent. It was laid down from a case in the 17th century. Chucked out, just like that, on the whim of one judge and the MI5. So it overthrows 300 years of legal case history, just like that. And nobody in the media made a fuss about it. They didn't care. I mean, it's just crazy. So the judge ordered the jury to convict, and they did. I mean, they had to. But I have to say, when they brought in the verdict, I was sitting opposite them, and they were, some of them were in tears. They knew that there was a travesty of justice going on. The only time either of us was ever allowed to say anything about why we'd done what we did was after Dave's conviction. They bailed him overnight. I should point out that he was charged on 3 counts under the Official Secrets Act, so he was facing 6 years in total, not 2. And he went back the next day, and I was allowed to take to the witness stand, and I was allowed to plea for mitigation. And it's the only time either of us ever had a say about why we'd done what we did. And David then got sentenced just to 6 months, thank God, of which he served 7 weeks and then did another 7 weeks with an electronic tag around his ankle. But I have to say as well, when he went to prison, he was put in Belmarsh High Security Prison for most of that time. This is where the internees, the Al-Qaeda suspects, are put. This is where terrorists go and serial murderers and people like that. And he was left there for weeks. I think they were hoping that something would happen to him. However, for some inexplicable reason, a rumour went round Belmarsh saying that David Shayler was a former spy. He was trained to kill with his bare hands. I don't know where that came from, but it worked. I'm not going to comment one way or the other if that's true. Anyway, he survived his time. He came out. One other point as well about the trial, putting aside what went on inside the courtroom, the other thing that really shocked me was the newspapers. And I would like to just say a little word about this, because again, I'm not quite sure what the system is over here, but in the UK, they are very much controlled by the government, spin masters, and also, perhaps less well known, by the spies. A lot of the people who have jobs on big national newspapers tend to have gone to the same type of schools, same universities, as a lot of the people who go into MI6. MI6 has a dedicated section called Information Operations, IOPS, which plants stories in the media, which then, of course, become fact as people look at them and do research into them. Also, they have nice, cosy little lunches with the editors of national newspapers where they say things like, oh, you don't want to listen to Shayler, old chap, he's a Walter Mitty character. He's a fantasist. He's got a grudge, all that sort of thing. Anyway, yes, there was a whole array of journalists sitting opposite the courtroom. I was watching them writing down the judge's words, his formal judgment at the end of the court case. And lo and behold, the judge, after I'd made my plea of mitigation, said, well, I accept that Mr. Shayler did what he did in what he thought was the public interest. I accept that he didn't put anyone's lives at risk. No agent lives were put at risk. And I accept that he had no venal motivation. His motives were pure. And the journalists were, putting it all down in their shorthand. So again, imagine my surprise, it's my favourite phrase tonight, when the headlines the next day all pretty much said, Shayler sold agent lives down the river for money. This is why I wrote the book. Get our side of the story out. Anyway, just to wrap up, fast forward, as I said, I just want to sort of share this experience. I think it covers a lot of the same sort of issues as trying to get to the truth of 9/11 sometimes. It's like pulling teeth. Since he's finished his sentence, we've been very active campaigning. We wrote the book. I had to submit it to MI5 for clearance, otherwise I would have gone to prison. And those lovely people sat on it for almost a year and a half. This was during the time of the run-up to the Iraq War, the Hutton whitewash, the Butler report, all sorts of things coming out about spies and how they went up to the job and how they were lying, they had no decent intelligence. And I really wanted to get my book out and say, look, this is what I've been saying for years. They haven't changed. And the government sat and sat and sat on my book. It finally came out last year. But we've been very active as well, doing a number of campaigns. There's a plan to bring in a very sophisticated ID card system in the UK, where they're going to put biometric information on it, and as well as all your social data, your bank details, your medical records, social security number, everything. And there's a big campaign against that in the UK at the moment. And obviously we've been doing a lot on that front. Been very involved in the peace campaign, the Stop the War Coalition. And of course, up from last year, the 9/11 Truth campaign. That is really burgeoning in the UK. And there are groups springing up all over the place, and not a huge number, perhaps 1,000 proper dedicated activists. But, you know, they see what happens. This is even before 7/7 happened. There is a lot of disillusion in the UK about being taken into an illegal war on the basis of lies from our Prime Minister. There is a lot of concern about the lack of accountability, about the lack of power, the fact we can't get rid of this liar. So people are becoming more politically aware, I suppose, for the first time in a generation. There is a silver cloud somewhere in there. And I'd just like to finish on a slightly more positive note. I haven't brought everyone's spirits right down. The whole point about this story is, yes, you know, sometimes it's been awful, but it has tested us, and we've come through it, and we've learned so much about ourselves in the process and what we can withstand, and also useful skills and useful contacts to take forward things like the 9/11 Truth campaign. So, you know, I'm living proof. I am living proof. I haven't been bumped off yet. You know, let's all go out there. Let's all fight. Just forget about fear. Don't worry about what the government can do to us. We can go out and we can change things. Thank you very much.